Centuries ago, a wise old rabbi once asked his students how they could tell when night had ended and day was on its way back. A student responded, "Could it be when you see an animal in the distance and can tell whether it is a sheep or a dog?" The old rabbi answered, "No." Another student said, "Could it be when you look at a tree in the distance and can tell whether it is a fig tree or a peach tree?" And again, the old rabbi answered, "No." Now the students were becoming frustrated. "Well then, when is it?" The old rabbi pondered for a moment and then gently said, "It is when you look at the face of another man or woman and see that he or she is your brother or sister. Because if you cannot do that, then no matter what time it is still night for you." The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. John's gospel begins with a riddle, with a poem, with an overture. These few lines have inspired more theological writing and discourse than any other chapter in the New Testament. Majestic words echoing the creation, "In the beginning," a prelude of Christian faith and tradition that speaks about God, eternity, light of all people. Words so beautiful, so poetic, so bold that from them whole communities find their meaning. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. But that's not quite what I want to hear during Christmas. You see, here's what I would prefer John to have said. The light shines in the darkness did not overcome it. The darkness did not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness still exists. On Christmas morning, I want to hear John declare that when the light comes into the world, it destroys the darkness. I want the light to be so bold that cancer vanishes. I want the light to be so bright that tornadoes lift from the earth and floodwaters recede and our planet stops warming. I want the light to evade the darkness with such power that every sadness, every despair, every heartache begins to soothe and comfort and gladden. I want the light to meet the darkness in a manner that is so overwhelming, so completely devastating, so blind that sharp tongues are silenced, that guns are buried in the dirt, that we look into the face of a stranger and see their humanity. Yes, that's what I want to hear this Christmas tide. But instead, John says this: the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The light came into the world, and the darkness did not extinguish it. 2,000 years later, we can hardly argue that the light came, that the darkness was chased away, and that gladness and joy cover the earth. All one has to do is read the New York Times or go walk around the city. One could even surmise that the darkness has gained ground. Violence, racism, economic inequality, distrust, hatred appears to reign. Hatred of those who look differently, believe differently, pray differently. Police brutality, rapidly increasing rates of homelessness, religious war. We waited in the shadows of Advent. We kept vigil for this light. It was to be the light of all lights, and yet the darkness still remains. The light shines in the darkness, John proclaims. Perhaps that's the simple truth and the point. It is not that the light conquers the darkness, but simply that the light is there. God is there. God is here. Perhaps that's the whole message of John's poem, of his riddle this morning. God enters into the darkness to sit with us. Instead of dwelling in the heavens above, God climbs down into this dark place to be with us, maybe even puts on human flesh, maybe. That's the hope. That's the light that burns within the darkness, that we are not left alone. God is not dead or asleep, but God is with us, kindling light among the shadows. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness do not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness. And here's the other half of that promise, that hope. The darkness did not overcome it. The darkness could not, the darkness cannot overcome that light that is kept alive. No matter how strong its power, no matter how ready or robust its ammunition, the darkness cannot overcome the light. 2,000 years ago, a baby was born in a stable, the poorest of the poor. And yet during his lifetime, he says things that are so bold, so astonishing, that millions of people are still living their lives by them today. He said things like, "Love thy neighbor. Turn the other cheek. Forgive one another." But most astonishing, when he was just a bit older than I am today, he was brutally crucified for telling people to love each other. And the men who killed him thought, that's it, that's the end of it. He's dead, he's gone, game over. And yet here we are. Here we are 2 millennia later in a city halfway around the globe, singing hymns and telling stories of his birth. They tried to shut out the morning. They tried to snuff out the light, but they couldn't. They can't. The simple core message of the gospel: love each other. See each other's humanity, to look into a man or a woman's face and see that he or she is your brethren. They tried to extinguish it. They tried to snuff out that light. And yet religious communities all across Boston, including this one, are doing their part to learn about Islam, to combat fear and misunderstandings of our brothers and sisters. And the darkness cannot overcome it. And yet, when thousands upon thousands of Syrian refugees were facing violence and death and fled, hundreds of countries around this world opened their doors and said, "Welcome. You're home now." And the darkness could not overcome it. And yet, when millions around this country have awoken from a deep sleep and found their way through powerful shadows to rise up against racial discrimination and inhuman practices, and the darkness could not overcome it. The darkness still exists. It might always exist, but so does that light. And that light, the light of all people, is strong. It is blinding strong. That's the message of John's gospel this Christmas time, the promise and the hope. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot, will not overcome it. The day is dawning. God dwells among us. Thanks be to God.